Good morning, Sunnyvale. Good morning. It was spring of 1999. It was track season, but I was skipping practice. I was signing out at the office because I was going to get my braces tightened. You guys remember those days? Sarah Tyler came bounding up. Sarah Tyler was a very popular junior, the kind who did both sports and cheerleading and was really personable and really kind, and you just really wanted to be her friend. Not only that, her family, since the 1960s, had been part of our small Arkansas town, surveying and mapping, and I will go ahead and give them a little plug. Tyler Surveying Mapping, Greenbrier, Arkansas. But Sarah was so cool, and so when she asked me to be in the Miss Greenbrier pageant, it was hard for me to say no, because even though I had been there for 4 years in a small town, you're still the new kid, even if you've been there for years. So I thought about it, and if anyone else had asked me, I would have said no way. But I talked to my parents, and they said, go ahead. So I entered the pageant, and you can see on the screen that as soon as the lights came up, I was sporting my little preppy capris and my sparkly evening gown, and I spoke my 17-year-old mind, and thought I would change the world. And I want to let you know that here before you today is Miss Greenbrier, 1999, first runner-up. Ha ha! Old runner-up Regester, they called me. Just kidding, no one called me that, but you may. And just a shout out to Mother Teresa. Thank you so much for going through that. I sang Sandy Patty's Via Dolorosa like it was the last time I was going to get to talk about Jesus, so I feel like I was a great witness. But I bring it up today just to give you a little chuckle, a little history about me, but also to kind of, I clickbaited you into this just to let you know that it's not just about pageants. There is something deeper in the book of Esther, and we're going to explore that today. We're going to explore what Esther has to do with the church and a deeper meaning for the people of God. Let's pray. Father in heaven, I'm excited to be here today to represent you. I ask that you would shut me up if a word that I'm about to speak would not be in some way representative of you. And Lord, I just ask that my friends would wheel me out if you do indeed decide to strike me this morning. God, I love you, and I'm excited to worship you through the word. Amen. Well, I want to give you a little bit of a background about the book of Esther. I put on my promo that if you hadn't read it ever or recently, it would be helpful to this sermon, but I'm going to do my best to be all-inclusive, which is a terrible thing to do in this sermon. But if you would toss me up that background slide, there are some really, really interesting things about the historical time period that the book of Esther was written in. The setting's 483 to 473 BC, and what's going on during the book of Esther is the Greco-Persian Wars. Do you know about those? If you ever watched the Battle of 300, you know about those. It was a very inaccurate portrayal of what the Persians looked like. But nonetheless, it's a lot of fun. And the Persian Empire, their goal, since Cyrus, their goal was just to increase. And so they were going after those pesky Europe-type places that hadn't yet been annexed. And they were soundly defeated. And in fact, Herodotus wrote that after being defeated at Salamis, our buddy Ahasuerus or Xerxes sailed back and took comfort in his harem. So that's kind of when we believe that the book of Esther came about. Interesting history and kind of an explanation for why he did what he did with the beauty pageant. Now, the author of Esther is really fun to try to figure out. I don't know where your bets are if you're a betting person, but I'm actually going to put my money on Esther herself because I can't wait to get to heaven, and then she's going to be like, yeah, of course, it was someone Jewish. I'm Jewish. Of course, it was somebody really close to the courts. I'm close to the courts. Of course, it was someone witty and intelligent. I just think it was probably Esther, but there's no proof of that. It was definitely someone well acquainted with the Persian courts because they had the details down, and it was somebody who was in favor of the Jews. Now, the genre of Esther is that it is a historical narrative, but there's a little but in there because it is the most wild historical narrative in the whole Bible. Most of the time, the Bible gives you clues on how to read it. It says, and I was in vision, and you know it's what? A vision. Or it says, like, here is some poetry from the, harp of David or whatever, and you know it's a song and full of metaphor, and then some is like, here's the genealogies, and you're like, yeah, all right, clearly historical. But the thing about Esther that has puzzled scholars forever is that it's such a literary masterpiece. It is so sophisticated in its use of, the author really likes twos. Everything comes in twos. The author really likes irony. The author loves reversals. You think something's going to happen, and then it gets flipped. And so it does seem to be like the theater's kid book. It's like if you really love drama and limelight, Esther may be for you. And then the summary of Esther, I made it as short and sweet as I can. This is, hopefully it gets you. Oh wait, you could go back because I wanted to read that. Jewish girl wins a beauty pageant and replaces the Persian queen while keeping her identity a secret. That's important. Through a series of providential events, she saves her people from a jealous courtier bent on her and their destruction. So if you guys don't know the story, please go read the book of Esther right after the sermon, and many of your questions about the sermon will be answered. The reason I got so jazzed about this book is that I've done a 5-week Bible study on this, on Ask a Christian, the YouTube channel that I run. And when I started getting to the end with my co-host, Chad Reed, we started pulling up all these little things that seemed like Bible prophecy. What's Bible prophecy? As my friend Mark says, I'm glad you asked. Bible prophecy, they say, is either forthtelling or foretelling. Wait, telling or foretelling? Well, now I'm getting all confused. But basically, it's speaking up in the name and character of God. And it can be predicting the future, but it's not necessarily. And Bible prophecy is a lot of times just a scary word, but it really means like, hey, here's God's stopwatch, and I want you to look at it because there are things that are going to be going down in the world, and I want to name them before they happen so that when they come to pass, you have something to stand on. You have something to believe. And of course, I believe why I'm doing this sermon today is I have read and believed that there are some things in Esther that are so beautiful and so tightly packed that they can be nothing except a picture within a picture of a bigger fight of good versus evil that in our denomination we call the Great Controversy. Have you heard of it? It's kind of a big deal. But I want to review it because I do realize that there are all kinds of folks tuning in and enjoying this, and I don't want to leave you hanging. And so you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I want to show you a little bit. It's a very, very brief. Oh, yeah, so why am I reading Esther wrong? And the key is that I believe it has some prophetic things to say about our church. Okay, so here is the tiniest nutshell I felt like I could squeeze this into. I thought, if I can't get it on one screen, then it's too big to like put as a preface to a sermon. So here's the Great Controversy in a nutshell. Ask me later for the Bible verses that go with this. But humanity is involved in a war between Christ and Satan over the character or law of God. People have heard that there was a war in heaven, but a lot of the pictures, like some of the great painters, showed it with the sword and shield. But what it really is, it comes from the Greek word is polemos, and the word is politics. We're pretty familiar with that word these days. And the fight in heaven was only over ideas of who was worthy of worship. And so the enemy, whom we now call Satan, the enemy's main argument is that God is not worthy of worship. Now, in heaven, we've got a few clues like in Isaiah and Ezekiel about what this enemy was like before he defected, and this was an angel of perfection and light. And actually, was one of the closest to the throne of God, one of the best witnesses to what the character of God should have been like. So you can imagine the stab in the heart, the disloyalty when this different view came out. So that was his main argument, that God is not worthy of worship. Oh, well, who do you suppose is? In a vacuum, a lot of times we like to find something else that's worthy of worship. And Satan, the Satan, found himself to be. On earth, Satan led Adam and Eve into disobedience, and then he claimed rulership of the earth. So if you've ever wondered, how did sin, selfishness, all that come to the earth? It's because earth became a test site for this new idea of government. So Satan says, I will come down. These people who God loves and has set up to take care of the earth, if I could get them to disobey God and find my government better by any means necessary, then I would have an edge in this war. So this gets turned around only when Christ comes to the earth and begins a counter-revolution. We'll talk about it later, but Satan really overplayed his hand at the cross. As the heavenly hosts are trying to decide if Satan really had good ideas or not. Satan, by the way, is not a capitalized name, but it means the adversary, the enemy. So when we say Satan, the Satan, that's what we're meaning. But when Satan overplayed his hand at the cross, all of the observant universe said, oh, okay, we see what your ways lead to. And in the heavens, this great war was won. Now, we're still waiting for Earth to get the memo. Revelation's final scenes illustrate Satan's last-ditch effort to overcome, to take as many lives as he can, a last-ditch effort. And we also see in the end of Revelation 20, there's this beautiful verse that says that that heaven does not close its gates day or night, assuming even as it descends to the earth, the doors are wide open. And you've heard of that last battle of Armageddon. That's where Satan is rallying people from the earth who did not go to heaven, saying, we can take it one more time. And he attempts to take by force what was his all along. It's a sad story. Now, that's my nutshell, great controversy, good versus evil. And the cool thing about the Bible is that if God tries to give us a message, he rarely gives it once. Repetition is key for learning, at least for me, especially as I get older. And the Bible doesn't disappoint. And as I started to read Esther, some bits and pieces of this story started unfolding. I hope you'll look at it with me from that perspective and see if you can dig it out as well. I think we're going to talk about some of the types in Esther now. Can I have the next slide? Oh, yeah. All right. I found some really great photos on Canva. I loved Mordecai's beard. That's why I picked that one. So in this story, the main characters are, of course, Esther, Mordecai, Haman, King Xerxes. Oh, don't go through them. Mordecai was a Jewish-born person who took in the fatherless. Does this start to speak to you? Born a Jew, adopted, is holding a standard for his nation, refuses to bow to Haman, and acknowledge that he is a power or a ruler that has sway over him. Haman is the evil character in this story. And as we mentioned before, it's a little bit stage ready, and he seems like the ultimate villain. Some of the things that Haman does in the story are really just dig at Mordecai. And he is the sworn enemy of Mordecai and the Jewish nation. And he ends up twisting the plot whichever way he can, getting King Xerxes to sign a death decree saying that that all the Jews in not just the capital city of Susa, but all the Jews in the empire are an affront to the king and will be put to death. And then, wow, you can go to the next one. And then we have Esther, whose name Esther means star, but in Hebrew, her name Hadassah means myrtle. And myrtle is something that brides would wear, a crown of myrtle. And so it was interchangeable with bride. And we see Esther here as a dutiful, obedient woman who has courage and ends up saving her people by requesting the king to look at the decree and to grant her her life and her people's life as well. Now, Xerxes, I did pick the 300 picture for him. Xerxes in this story is a little bit of a rogue, and he seems to represent the Father in heaven because he sits on the throne. However, because he receives bad counsel and is a dude who's not after God, he kind of fluctuates back and forth between having this really regal representation and then being kind of a Greek everyman, or a Persian everyman, I guess, since he was Persian. So these characters, I want to submit to you, look as we read this story, look as you read throughout Esther. I want to submit to you that Mordecai is representative of Jesus, that Haman, his sworn enemy, is representative of Satan, the Satan, that Esther is representative of not Jesus, as I learned growing up. People said, look at her work interceding on behalf of her people. It's definitely a Christ-like thing that she does, but I want to show you that I believe she represents the church in this story. And then Xerxes kind of bumps back and forth between God and every man, a man of the world. So check that out as you read, and then we will get into a little bit more of why I think what I think, and we can talk about it here as we go on. So that's just a sample of the amazing representations that you find in Esther, just those main characters, but there's all kinds of different literary types, there's all kinds of different allegory, and while I believe that Esther is true, I also believe that something can be true and still a representative of a bigger thing. So join me now as we go to one of my favorite chapters in Esther, which I have entitled Dinner with the Devil. Esther chapter 7. We'll take a little look at this today. So, what is happening in Esther chapter 7? Everything that has now been packed into your head, all the history and background of Esther, all the details of the great controversy, pack those in, because as we start reading, I want you to be able to ask and answer questions about what do these represent? Let's take the story as true, and then what else can we get from it? So, what has just happened in Esther 6 is that Esther, although she had not come before the queen in 30 days, wanted to ask the king to save her people. And so she goes in before him. And by the way, the reason why you don't just bust up in on a king is not because he's rude and doesn't want to have visitors, but because you could be on some kind of terrible mission to hurt him. And so that's why you could lose your life. People don't ask questions in some of these ancient civilizations. You bust up in unannounced, we don't recognize you, we're swinging the axes. So Esther took her life into her hands in the last chapter, and she comes before the king, and she says, hey, I have this big thing on my heart. He says, Esther, up to half my kingdom, which, by the way, is a saying. I don't know if any king would actually give it away, but in the middle of the kingdom was usually the temples of worship. And so when somebody would say up to half my kingdom, they would be up until the half that God owns. So up to half my kingdom, what do you want? Now, Esther's been fasting for 3 days, and like a girl after my own heart, she asked to go to dinner. But it wasn't about the dinner. She asked the king and Haman to come before a dinner, and they sit down and talk and eat, because I think she knows that a way to anyone's heart is through their stomach. And so they have their first meal. The king presses her and says, what do you want? And she says, I would like to go to dinner with you again tomorrow. I don't know if that's smart or shady, getting 2 meals for the price of one, but that's what Esther did. So here we are in chapter 7, going into the second banquet. In the first banquet, Haman leaves like so on cloud 9 because he was the only other person invited to this banquet. Meanwhile, this man had been planning evil for Esther and all of her people, and he is walking into this oblivious. He does not know that this is potential judgment on his head. So here we go. Let's read it together. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther?" Why is it that he has to ask her, by the way? She's got this need to save her people and herself. But I find that I sometimes need spiritual promptings for the deepest desires of my own heart as well. And I think that this could be God saying to us, "Hey, my people, my church, what is it that you want?" Prompting us to speak up and ask requests of the king. Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request." Another interesting thing here is that throughout the book of Esther, she usually speaks in the third person. I think it's similar to how in Spanish there is a very formal form and how something intimate is just too casual. And this is one of the first times where it says, "If I have found favor and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me, my petition, my people at my request." So she is getting more intimate with her conversation, more free with her conversation. I think this is the only part that as a kid, I really saw Christ in Esther. And it's not because Esther is a type of Christ, as I mentioned before, but because she is acting on behalf with the will and the personality of Christ here. Christ desires to intercede for all of his people, and he's put that on Esther's heart. She is interceding for herself and her people. Verse 4, "For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." If Esther represents the church here, what do you think it means that she's been sold, her people, and she for destruction? Could it be that Satan has sold out this world for destruction? Would that make sense with our theory? For annihilation. And another thing I thought was interesting in verse 4 is that she says the king could never, the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. That really stood out to me because when we think about the reasons why God would want to be with us, or why traditionally preachers talk about why we should go intercede for the lost, we hear a lot, not necessarily in this church, but we hear a lot about saving them from flames of hell or saving them from destruction. But what I love about this verse is it tells us that diversity and uniqueness is important to the king. I love that the reason that we want to save people is because every single human, every single design of a person is important and beautiful and valuable to the king. Yeah. Verse 5, "So King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, answered and said to Queen Esther, 'Who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?'" Now this is a very interesting verse to me, probably my favorite one, because I had a big aha at this moment. Because obviously the king is here being floored. This is not something he's heard of before, and he really wants to know. In real life, this king wants to know, who has set up my lovely and beautiful queen for destruction? Who in the world would do that? And you guys know who it is. It's the guy sitting real close to the throne. It's that number 2 guy. He's duped him. Now that, everything here is not quite a match to what we are saying happened in the original conflict of good versus evil, but it's very similar. I wonder what's going through the king's head right now as he is starting to realize, it's got to be somebody who has the power of my signet ring, somebody who's got the power in this kingdom to do something like that. He's racking his brain trying to figure it out. And I wonder how long Haman sits there thinking, should I speak up? I can't imagine he's gone through all this, figuring out who Mordecai is, being his sworn enemy, hating this guy, setting him up for failure. I can't imagine he did that, seeing Mordecai come in and out of the courts to visit Esther and didn't research that family background and didn't know that they were connected. And that if one's a Jew, guess what? The one who grew up with him, probably a Jew. I'm wondering if he's sitting there sweating in his armpits thinking, oh, this is the second banquet. I should stop with the first. But he doesn't say anything. It's a chance for true repentance, but he doesn't say anything. And Esther says, the adversary, an enemy, is this wicked Haman. It really reminds me of that parable in Matthew 13, where all the disciples are sitting around Jesus asking the same question we're asking today. How did evil and sin get into the world? And Jesus tells this parable about sowing seed and weeds coming up. Jesus says there was a great landowner who sowed all this good seed, and then while he was sleeping, an enemy came in and sowed tares or weeds. And he says 5 words that change our view of how sin got into the world. Those 5 words are, an enemy has done this. It sounds very similar to Esther calling out Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen, God and the church, perhaps. Verse 7, then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. I was wondering why the garden. A lot of decisions in the Bible, a lot of big decisions have taken place in gardens. Can you think of any? Yeah, you got that Garden of Eden, got that Garden of Gethsemane. So just an interesting note. And history tells us that this man loved the garden. He found peace there, that Xerxes actually was a tree-hugging hippie of sorts. He loved shade trees. But the king goes into the garden, and Haman stood before Queen Esther pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. All right, here's what's funny and interesting to me, is that Haman stays. Would you guys stay or would you jet? Is there any place in the kingdom that this guy can go and find safety? I don't know. I probably would try. I would probably try. I would run, and I would dye my hair, and I would put on a fake mustache, and I'll just try to get out of there. But he stays, and he pleads for his life. Now, here's something that is probably, I don't know, maybe it's just tradition, but I was reading some of the rabbis' views on this verse, and the rabbis were saying that this is already going too far because there should be no man in a room with the queen when the king is not there. And even if the king is there, he's supposed to stay a respectful 10 feet or so. That was kind of the tradition on that. And so he's in there pleading for his life. And then let's check out verse 8. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Okay, what kind of fallen is this, do you think? Is it like, oops, I tripped and now I'm on the couch? No, this is not that kind of fallen. This is the kind of fallen that an enemy does. It says, and they fell upon their prey kind of fallen. He had fallen across the couch where she was. This alone is worthy of death. This alone would be a death sentence for that man. And it sounds like he already knew that the king had made his decision. So this is assault to injury. And the king comes back in. What was he wondering while he was out in his garden? Was it, if I should punish this guy? Or was it, how should I take care of this problem? I think it was the how. I think he already knew something was up. He had to do something. But imagine his situation as a king with his second in command, making him look a fool, first of all, threatening his own wife, treason. All kinds of things were racing through his head, I'm sure. And so he has to decide, how can I make this king and kingdom look strong while still dealing with this new nemesis that was so close? I've been so betrayed. Does it sound like anything that happened in heaven to you? It did to me. And so he seems to hold back on the sentencing while he figures it out. Now look at what that gives us time to get into. So the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. Very interesting here how the king holds back on judgment until he has witnesses surrounding him, and the witnesses themselves judge the evil one. The witnesses themselves say, oh, I've seen him with my own eyes now commit treason. I know what's going on. And they suggest the punishment in kind of a roundabout way. It's again, one of the theater actors being like, oh my king, there just happens to be some gallows over here that this guy made for this guy, Esther's uncle, So it's a bit funny. And this is where the story, gets reversed. That the evil that Haman set up to do is actually reversed and ends up being good and positive for the Jewish people. I'm going to go a little bit into chapter 8 because there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about, and who knows where the chapter breaks were supposed to be anyway. That's not divine. That's just somebody trying to break up a scroll so they can read it, On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. So the reversal happens. Haman gets hung. Mordecai gets exalted, made wise, made a ruler in the king's house. And then Esther gets the territory. Picking up what I'm laying down, Esther gets the territory that used to belong to Haman. If there is a spiritual application here, what would we expect that to mean for the church? If that's prophetic, what would we expect that to mean for the church? That the territory that Satan once took over in the beginning of the great controversy will be restored to God's people, the church. And by the way, when I say church, I don't mean this church. I don't even mean the Christian church necessarily. I do mean people who are following Christ. I do mean people who are living in a godly fashion. And then look what happens at the very end. Verse 2 is where I'll stop. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So Esther has the territory that Haman used to have, but who is the ruler? Mordecai. Sounds very much like the ending of the great controversy, where the church gets to inherit, God's people get to inherit the world all over again and are in love with and singing hosannas to Christ our King. Amen. Very similar, right? Yeah. So what are some takeaways from this? And by the way, I really, really hope that you study this more on your own. I mean, I was just, showering this morning, washing my hair and got a new one. Or I was eating cereal the other day and I was like, oh, the two banquets. This gets real deep, so ignore this if you don't know the story. But I was wondering about this dinner with the devil. Why is Haman here? Because if it were me, I would just tattle and leave. I would just be like, hey, king, here's the situation. But to face your accuser, to face somebody that you think is the enemy, and here's what it is. This is a time of judgment. This is a time of judgment where you can read in Revelation, there's actually a marriage supper of the Lamb. So check that out. I'm not going to give away too much more, but it's a little grotesque. So let's talk about takeaways for the church. You can go to the next slide, or the one with the takeout. Yeah, I like takeout. Here are some things to take to heart if you believe, like I do, that this gives us a glimpse into the great controversy. Because like I said, God doesn't want to tell a story one time, one way. There are different stories that speak to different hearts, and we can see little pieces of that story unfolding here. And so if Esther does represent the church, which I believe it does, we have a part to play in this ancient battle. We have a part to play in what's coming next. And I've come up with 4 things that all start with the letter R because I'm trying to be like Mark. Yeah. And I thought maybe it would help us remember a little bit. So you guys can go to the first one. There's a wedding dress. The first thing that we can take to heart is that we, like Esther, need to reveal our identity. Who are we? What is the church of God? We are called to be the bride of Christ. What does that mean? That means we are to be prepared for him in beauty. And beauty in the Bible is synonymous with character. We need to have the character of Christ. One of my favorite things about this denomination in particular is that we talk about these 3 end-time messages in the book of Revelation. One of those messages is all about revealing the character of God to a world who has been lied to. Do you know people who have a really bad view of God because they've heard about this eternal hellfire and suffering or this God of judgment? Our goal, the Seventh-day Adventist Church's goal, is to reveal the beauty of God to a world who has been lied to about his character. Number 2, we have to represent. Just like Esther, the church is called to represent those who are lost, who are under the death decree, who are under the penalty of death. And our identity, our association with that is really important. A lot of times, as Christians, we distance ourselves from people who we think are not like us, or they're in the world, or we have all these different things that we like to say. But the truth is, if Esther is a picture of the church, then she saves herself by identifying and representing her people. Not alone, not apart from them. She looks for people who are under the death decree, and she says, sign me up, because if they're going down, I'm going down too. That's where her real bravery lies. And our love for the lost, for those under the curse, should motivate us to action. Not because we're scared, but because we know the loss of one single human would be a loss for the universe. One single experience would be a loss for the collective universe. Number 3, you guys are probably going to be feeling this one with me. We need to ready ourselves for assault. Just as the king went out into the garden already having judgment, our king has already decided what's happening at the end of this story. But just like Haman threw himself against Esther in the final part of this story, we know that Satan, realizing his time is short before judgment comes, will be throwing himself against the church. He'll be looking for ways to tear down corporately and individually, because we know that the church is just made up of people. And I want you to ready yourselves. I want you to know what's coming. But the last one, I want you to revel in the knowledge that justice is coming. I want you to revel in the knowledge that justice is coming. If this story is a picture of a final judgment, there will be a reversal. The church will inherit the new earth with Christ as our ruler. So there's a book called The Desire of Ages that has a really beautiful passage about Satan overplaying his hand. We talked about that in the beginning. And Satan saw that his disguise was torn away. His administration was laid bare before unfallen angels and the universe. Heaven saw what was going on. Heaven knew that Satan's government was not working out. The unfallen angels and the rest of the universe have seen, we are just waiting for us to get it. And I love this. I'll read this from Desire of Ages, page 761. And for the sake of man, Satan's existence must be continued. You wonder why there's still pain, suffering today? God could have easily slapped that lightning button and destroyed him. But man, as well as angels, must see the contrast between the Prince of Light and the Prince of Darkness. He must choose whom he will serve. It's a choice. Cannot be forced. If you force something, you get the other thing. And God knows that. In his wisdom and power, he knows you have to see for yourself what Satan's government yields versus what his government yields. And guys, I believe that Esther has told this story. Now, as we close, I want to say I've talked about Esther mainly as a corporate thing. But there are some things that have happened this week that I know have brought a lot of us low. I know people who have lost loved ones just this week, very close to them. I know people with fractured relationships. I know people who are battling illness. And so I want to say to you that there's a reversal coming, and the devil will hang from the gallows that he has set up to trap Christ.